Hello, my name's Jude Scott and I'd like to show you painting a landscape in a gorge in the northwest of Western Australia. It's a place we've travelled to and I've photographed this gorge with really interesting vegetation and lots of varied colours, of various shades of green. You've got the bright green ferns, the palms in the far distant background, and even that pale blue-grey spinifex cascading down the sides of the gorge. Here I've dropped in just some pale cobalt as a wash for the sky. You don't have to be too fussy with the sky because the painting is not about the sky and if you go in too bright it will take the focal point away from the rest of the gorge and where you want people's eyes to travel in the painting. I'm dampening the surface of the paper because it's very hot here today, and I want the vegetation and the cliffs when I drop them in to merge on the paper. So this is a combination of raw sienna, Quinacridone Gold and burnt sienna. So I'm putting that on. It's very strong. You need to go in much stronger than your finished colour because it will fade as the paint dries. And if I go in damp, I can put the vegetation over that and it will merge on the paper with the surface of the paint on the cliffs. So I'm just following the direction of the rocks in a vertical format, and I'm just having some skips over the surface of the paper where there are little dry areas, so you get white sparkles appearing on your paper that look quite interesting. It might be a reflection of some shiny leaves in the background, or maybe there are little white areas of rock tucked in amongst the vegetation. Colours I've used are Holbein paints, and they're raw sienna, Aureolin Yellow, Quinacridone Gold, beautiful colour, burnt sienna, it's very rich, vibrant burnt sienna, Cobalt Blue, 290 is my favourite, there's two Cobalt Blues, Ultramarine and a Mars Violet. The Mars Violet and 290 Cobalt make the most wonderful dark, rich, warm, dark. Now that the cliffs have just started to dry in certain sections, I've just flicked some water over just to give the impression of texture on those vertical surfaces so that they're not quite so flat. And here I'm dropping in a mixture of the Mars Violet and Cobalt Blue. Cobalt Blue 290 is the cobalt that I prefer. It's just a little softer than the straight cobalt, which is 291. Because the paper is still damp, that the dark shadows that I'm painting on the rocks now will merge and sort of blend really well with the warm undertones. So I'm just sculpting around the base of those rocks with my brush, trying to sort of get a bit of hit and miss happening with the lower end of the rocks there that go into the water. I've just made it a little bit paler in the background there, a little bit of extra water on the brush so that the far distant background is paler. I always like to make my shadows a warm shadow rather than a cool shadow. Very rarely do I use cool shadows in a painting. The paper that I'm using here is Saunders Waterford, 300 grams, and it's a rough surface. So it's got a lovely texture all of its own, perfect for dragging you brush across that to get little skips in the paper and to get some interesting texture appearing. I'm mixing up now just some Cobalt with some raw Sienna, just to block in roughly some of those masses of spinifex that are cascading down the sides of the cliffs and the sides of the gorge. So practice using your brush. You can do all sorts of wonderful marks with your brush. Practice on a piece of paper until you can sort of almost automatically do the marks on your painting that you want to use to create the looks of that vegetation. And there's lots of interesting things you can do. I really like calligraphy brushes, the Chinese calligraphy brushes or Japanese calligraphy brushes. They've got wonderful long hair that holds a lot of pigment and holds a lot of paint, and you can do wonderful straight lines with them right across a full sheet of paper if you've got a loaded brush with lots of paint in. Those colours there are just still merging on the paper. It can take quite a while. Saunders Waterford paper tends to hold the moisture longer and stay wetter longer than any other paper, and it works beautifully with Holbein paints. Holbein paints don't have any animal products in them, and I think that the surface of the paper for Saunders Waterford seems to have a real affinity with the Holbein paints. So I'm now just using the flat side or the long side of my brush just to move almost horizontally across the paper. I haven't got a lot of water on my brush, but I do have a lot of pigment. You'll notice that I keep rinsing my brush and I dry it and get just the right amount of pigment before I start dragging it excuse me, onto the paper. Some of the spinifex has that lovely blue-grey colour to it, so I like to block that in. And you can always scratch out over that. You can splatter like I was doing earlier, and you can use a fine rigger brush to put other marks in there to replicate the look of the vegetation that you want. So now I'm just adding some of the dark shadows that are there in that vegetation, and this is my version of the photograph. I'm not painting a painting that's absolutely slavish to that first image that I showed. I like to, I guess, focus on things that I like, that drew me to that area in the first place. So this is my interpretation of where I was on that day. I think the combination of warm and cool colours is very important, and also opposites. So warm and cool, light and dark. And here I'm going to splatter some warm marks onto that. I'm using some ultramarine and some burnt sienna, and just I've masked off the sky area of the painting, and now I'm just splattering some dark paint there for a bit of texture. It might look a little bit dark at the moment, but that will fade as it dries. Just get a couple of spots off there that are where they've landed where I don't want them to. A little bit more splatter. If you've got a long bristled brush, it's perfect for splattering work. If you're trying to do it with a brush that's got short synthetic bristles, best of luck, it doesn't seem to work half as good. You need a bristled, long bristles in your paintbrush to get it to flick off the end of the brush. So now I'm using some fairly dry paint, and the paper is fairly dry as well. So I'm going to sort of scumble some little gum trees. There were little trees and other shrubs clinging to these harsh cliffs and struggling to survive. Some of them were quite tropical and tough, others were quite delicate, so a real mixture of foliage. So I'm trying to replicate that with the marks I'm making on the paper. So I'm not trying to do any branches or twigs, this is just different masses of foliage that were there on the cliffs. And take your time. Don't feel that you have to rush this. In fact, at any stage of the painting where you're putting vegetation marks on the cliffs, you can stop, have a cup of tea and come back to it. It's not going to spoil. You won't ruin your painting. I have masked out a couple of little pale tree trunks that were there in the background. And I don't often use masking fluid because when you do, at some stage, you're going to have to resolve the edges of that mask when you take the mask off, and it can sometimes create more problems than it solves. So I've only used it very sparingly, and when the time comes, I will go back over that and soften those edges and have other vegetation coming over the front of it so that it doesn't look like it's being masked off. I don't want someone to look at the painting and go, oh gosh, they've used masking fluid there. So use it wisely. The trees on the opposite side, I'm using a dry brush with quite a bit of strong pigment. If you go in too pale at this stage, it will disappear and you won't be able to keep the fresh look of that vegetation if you go back over it. There were masses of beautiful fern hanging down here. I think it's actually called the Kimberley fern, and very tough fern, but it always looks so wonderful growing up north. It can survive probably because it's in total shade and water seeps down through the rocks. So there's masses of dark and light that you have to try and replicate to get that look of dense foliage with some light on the top edges of the ferns. And again, use your brush to describe the foliage, how it's hanging down. Now, there were two clumps of ferns. The one I'm going to paint now is the one that was in the foreground. So it's in I've made it a slightly brighter green because I want that to come forward in front of the other mass of fern. And again, I've got to mix up different tones of green and put some quite dark shadow in. This is actually the Mars Violet and Cobalt with a touch of Ultramarine. And I always find it really helpful before I start painting. I always mix up big puddles of my blue, the predominant blue that I'll use, which in this case is Cobalt, and raw sienna. Always mix up big puddles of raw sienna and whatever red I'm going to use. So in this case, it was kind of a mixture of Quinacridone Gold and burnt sienna to get that red for the cliffs. Sometimes if you have to stop and you don't really want to and mix up more paint, it can really it can cause you problems. having to match colours and things. It's just, I find it much easier to have the paint mixed up before I start. Just dragging in some of the darks now under that fern. Softening the edge because it was kind of tucked back underneath. And then just getting some of that fern, the colour of the fern, to bleed down into it so that it doesn't come out really harsh. Bit more of a flick for some texture in different areas. Now I'm going to use a rigger brush and start to put in some trunks and twigs and trees and things. So here I've just restating some of the darks and the shadows in that clump of ferns. This is a beautiful rigger brush. I just love using it. It's very, very long bristles. Rigger brushes were apparently originally invented for painting rigging in old sailing ships, so we're still using them today. And this particular one that I like to use has got very long hairs and natural hairs, and it gives beautiful fine marks. This wide brush that I use, that's also a fantastic brush to use. You can also just use a normal hake brush for this type of work, where you want to maybe add something into a damp area, but you won't lift off too much paint or have any marks that sort of stand out and are a little bit jarring. Great for blending edges of vegetation together to make it look a bit seamless. And the hairs in hake brushes are goat hair and very, very soft. So you can almost just trail it across the surface of the paint and you'll get beautiful soft edges. So now I've got a warm dark under the shadows for that, the clump of fern, and I'm just going in and restating some of the darks in the background to put a bit of distance between the first clump of fern, and the second clump. And again, just picking up that wonderful brush. The brush I was given by my wonderful artist friend Michael Soloviev from Montreal. Fantastic brushes. Now back to the rigger brush, and I'm going to put in some different trunks. I've mixed up with a bit of blue, cobalt blue, and a little bit of Mars violet. I don't want it too dark, but I want it dark enough so that when it dries I won't have to go back over it. And hopefully the brush marks will look lovely and fresh. So a little bit of green, a little bit of ultramarine, and putting some dark foliage, because some of these trees were actually quite tropical in appearance, with very dark green shiny leaves. And it's always good to have several tones of pigment when you're doing trees. You can't have them all one flat colour, because if you look at nature you'll never see a tree that's got leaves that are in thick bunches on branches that are all one colour. There's light and dark. Some of them are casting shadows over the other leaves, so you need a nice variation of tone. And you also need a variation in temperature. Some of the leaves will be warm, so you'll need warm greens and you'll need cool greens. So to make them look, even if you're doing a very stylized painting, you still have green in warm and cool colours. So to make it warmer, just add more raw sienna, maybe some Quinacridone Gold, depending on what blue you've used. Here I'm blocking in the trunks for the far distant palms. So I'm using some Mars Violet and some Cobalt Blue, and the palms have got quite a bit of texture there on them because they're skipping over the surface of that really beautiful rough paper. Always blend the base of trunks or palms out with just a touch of water, and it will stop them looking like they've been planted like a telegraph pole into concrete. You don't want a sharp edge where they meet the ground. Now for the leaves, I've got a very strong mix of pigment, and I'm going to use the side of my brush, almost horizontal on the paper, to sculpt in those leaves. If you think you can't do it, that's okay. Just try, grab an old painting and flip it over onto the back and try painting your leaves on a scrap of paper. Try the same marks that I'm using here, and you'll have leaves going in all directions. Again, really look at a palm tree and see if you can paint the leaves so that they look like a palm tree. You can often see palm trees that don't really look as much like a palm tree as they could. So they've got lots of negative space usually between the leaves, and that's what gives them the look of that particular palm. So I'm just going to blot out some light on those trunks just to break up that dark area a bit. Some of the leaves are going over the palms and some are coming in front. Now here is an image of a close-up of the palm trees, and you can see that I've got light and dark on the trunks and I've got light and dark in the leaves. So keep it mixed up so that it's not all flat, looking like folk art or something like that. You want to keep it mixed up. Variation, light and dark, and warm and cool leaves. So I'm just going in now to restate the darks. The first lot of leaves I put down are still damp, so some of this paint will actually blend in with that previous wash of leaves that I've put in, and some of it won't. So again, it'll break up that look and hopefully have a nice feeling of palm trees silhouetted against the sky. Now here's a close-up of the water, because the next clip I'm going to show you is the reflections in the water, and there was a lovely little cascade. So I'm just adding now to the reflections that are in the water. Just repeat in a loose fashion the colours that are in the rocks. You don't have to slavishly follow a photograph here if you don't want to. Of course, how you interpret the painting is up to you. You can abstract it out a little bit. You might want to use your impression of what it felt like there on the day. So I'm just putting in some marks. Some of the rocks were under the water, so they've got soft and hard edges, and the shadows in the water on the rocks are warm and cool. Don't have all the marks under the water in just one tone of colour. You need light and dark, and you need warm and cool. So here's the finished painting. I've added some pink and grey galahs in the far distant background. I've darkened up some areas of the main rock and darkened areas where the water's cascading over the little waterfall, and lifted out the reflections and splattered in the foreground. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and you can always leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see some more. Thank you very much.